AP World History students, I'm Miss Ziegler, the Time Machine teacher. Today we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution and the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and China. Before we get started, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. Get those notebooks ready. Here we go. Let's start with the Ottoman Empire. Up until this point, they had not adopted Western technology. There was a lot of corruption within their government and big ethnic divisions because their empire was so large. There were several different ethnic groups within the empire. Overexpansion of the empire also made it hard to control. As a result of this, they were nicknamed the sick man of Europe, and they failed to modernize. Also, at this time, the Ottoman Empire ruled Egypt. Remember the Mamluks back when we talked about the Mongols? They're still in Egypt, and they start to gain more power. They gain this power because they were the military class in Egypt, and they're going to gain this power through a man named Muhammad Ali. The Sultan doesn't like this, however, so he sends an army to try to conquer them. But during that conflict, Ali rises to power and becomes the new governor. He begins to act independently of the Sultan and to make reforms in Egypt. He wanted the government to be able to control the cotton production. So what he did is he taxed the peasants so high that they weren't able to afford the taxes, and eventually they had to give the land up to the government, giving the government complete control of cotton production. Then he pushed for more industrialization through factories and building ships. The Ottoman Empire as a whole, though, was not doing well economically. And this is due to the loss of trade with Europe, because now Europe didn't necessarily need to go through the Ottoman Empire. They had other routes that they could take. And the Janissaries are also losing their military edge. So in the beginning of the 18th century, reform begins in the Ottoman Empire. And this reform was led by the Sultan to try to update the army. Eventually, he will conquer the Janissaries and do away with them. In 1830, the Tanzimat reforms are passed. This led to more factories, Western styles of dress, and non-Muslims had equal rights under the law. The reforms also started to question who are the Ottoman people and what does it mean to be Ottoman? What was their identity? At that time, a new class of Ottomans rise up, the young Ottomans. They're going to seek changes within the political system itself. They wanted it to be a more European-style parliament, and at first they're quite successful. But after a short time, Sultan al-Hamid changed back to the old way of ruling. Opposition again started within the Young Turks. They were pushing for modernization and a Turkish state. In 1908, a military coup gave them power, and they began to secularize schools, courts, law codes. They also opened some modern schools for women. During this time, nationalist sentiments are going to grow, but not everybody looked at themselves as Turkish. Remember, there are a ton of different ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire, where these different ethnic groups want to start their own countries versus being a part of this huge empire. And at the end of World War I, due to all of these problems and World War I as a whole, the Ottoman Empire will collapse. So they never really industrialize in the same way that happens in Europe. They're just not successful at it. Let's move now to China. China is also suffering during this time. They have a huge population due to the American foods that had been brought over. In 1685, they were at 100 million people. And by 1853, their population had grown to 430 million people. Because they hadn't went through the Industrial Revolution, their farmers weren't able to keep up with that growing population. This resulted in high unemployment and starvation. The government also failed to keep up with the growing population in that they couldn't collect taxes properly. They weren't very good at social welfare or flood control. This is going to lead to a weaker central government. The other problem was that the Europeans had come in to trade opium in the 1800s. The Chinese didn't really like opium because it was negatively affecting their people, but of course the Europeans wanted to continue to sell it because they were making money off of it. This will lead to two wars that the Europeans win, and eventually China is split up in what's called spheres of influence, where European countries came in and kind of took control in those areas and continued to trade how they wanted to, which didn't really benefit China in the long run. It also kept them from industrializing. Along with all of this, there was social unrest in China. From 1850 to 1864, the Taiping Uprising occurred. The leaders were Christian. They wanted to redistribute land and do away with prostitution. They also wanted to get rid of opium and industrialize China. They even wanted less restriction on women, and some women even fought in the rebellion. These reforms were in sharp contrast to Confucius ideals. The Taiping held power briefly, but they were eventually defeated by the Qing dynasty, who had help from Western powers. The result of all this is that China's economy was so weak they were never able to industrialize. Opium was also a huge problem. It was considered kind of like a miracle cure for things like dysentery and other diseases, but it kept the Chinese people from being productive citizens. And as I said before, the Opium Wars lead to the opening of more ports and more trade with Western powers, as well as the spheres of influence get set up in China. This puts China more dependent on the West and on foreign businesses helping the Chinese economy. There is some resistance, though. The self-strengthening movement is one such event. This is where the Chinese are going to try to improve their systems. They improve the examination system, improve irrigation and flood control. They also try to build some factories and add more coal mines, as well as a telegraph. The problem was that these new industries relied on foreign money in order to operate, as well as foreign machinery. As a result, the self-strengthening movement was a failure. Another reform started called the 100 Days of Reform, which was supposed to industrialize China and take them to more Western-style ways. However, it was strongly opposed by the emperor's aunt, the Empress Cixi. Now, let me take a minute and tell you about this woman, because she's pretty incredible, especially for the time frame in which she lived. She was born in a small Manchu village and became one of the emperor's concubines, the lowest of his concubines. The job of the concubines was to produce heirs to the throne. Now, at the time, the emperor also had a wife, the empress, whose job was also to produce heirs to the throne, but the more heirs that they could have would be better, just in case one of them passed away. So, when she birthed a son, her status rose to right below the empress herself. And because the empress had never had any sons, when the emperor died, Cixi's son became emperor. However, at the age of 6 years old, he was too young, and so she served as regent until he could be a little bit older to serve. When he did come of age, she didn't want to give up power, so she kept him busy with opium and with pretty girls, and just tried to keep him out of the way so that she could keep power for herself. Her son ended up dying in 1875, and she put her nephew on the throne. He was only 3, though, and so she decided that she would still continue as regent. She gained the help of the army in order to keep her power. Once he came of age, she retired to the summer palace, but she continued to keep an eye on the government. And in 1898, when he started making some reforms that were just a little bit too modern for her, she once again had the army help in a coup to overthrow him and take back the power for herself. She ended up imprisoning him and doing away with his reforms, which included extending the railroads. She did eventually see some issues with the civil service exams, so she banned them. She wasn't quite finished yet, though. Before her death, she poisoned her nephew and set up her great-nephew on the throne of China. He would end up being the last emperor of China. While she was ruling, the Boxer Rebellion happened. She highly encouraged it. This was a rebellion against foreigners, basically to kick the foreigners out. It was led by militia leaders who killed Europeans and Christians. They took over the embassy at Beijing and were successful until the Japanese and Western powers came in and conquered them. After all of these things, the Chinese are very disillusioned with the Qing dynasty because they feel as though the Qing dynasty cannot protect them. And after the empress's death, when her great-nephew took over, he had until 1912 as emperor, until the Chinese Revolution started and he abdicated the throne. If we compare China and the Ottoman Empire, they have some similarities and differences concerning industrialization. Both lost autonomy and became semi-colonies of the Europeans. Neither were able to really successfully create industrial economies. One difference is that the Chinese revolutionaries rejected Confucianism more than the Turkish leaders rejected Islam, because Islam was more embedded within their government. Industrialization plays out a little bit differently in Japan than it does in China and the Ottoman Empire, in that Japan had seen what happened in China, and they decide to allow Europeans in, and they welcome modernization. However, this doesn't happen right away. From 1600 to 1854, Japan is really isolated from the world. But as I said before, they take note to what's going on in China and they decide they don't really want to have a war with Europe. So in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry comes and knocks on Japan's door and asks for trade, they will eventually let him in. This doesn't happen right away, though. This will eventually happen when reformers overthrow the shogun and put the emperor back in charge. And this is called the Meiji Restoration. It also happens very quickly. They abolish feudalism, which was an intense break with the past. The daimyo are replaced with governors, who are appointed by the government to collect taxes. The military is also reorganized, and the samurai lose their traditional privileges that were given to the warrior class. Confucian-style classes are taken away and everyone is considered one social class, as equals. For the most part, this transition was pretty peaceful. There was, however, a rebellion by the samurai that was put down using Western-style weapons. At first, there's a push for everything Western. Western hairstyles, Western clothes, but eventually those Western styles will mix a little bit with Japanese styles. They also establish a constitutional monarchy like the West. Shinto becomes their state cult rather than Christianity taking hold. Remember, Shinto is about ancestors and nature. There's also equality before the law and no more cruel and unusual punishment. New infrastructure is built, such as roads and railroads. There's a new school system that offers technical occupations as well. And industrialization is subsidized, such as silk production and weaponry and shipbuilding. Japan becomes a major textile exporter. They use that money to pay for the import of raw materials such as cotton. A distinctive feature of the Japanese industrialization is that they were able to pay for it themselves without outside help. But this has some consequences as the peasants are taxed very highly, and there are some rebellions among the peasants due to unrest. This happens in 1883 and 1884, but these rebellions are shut down. There's also labor that's needed for the textile factories, and women from the countryside come into the cities to work there, similarly to how it happened in Europe and the US. Unfortunately, wages are low and the conditions are terrible. Some tried to form unions, but it's illegal at the time. There is some advancement in women's rights as activists try to urge the end of concubinage and prostitution within China. They also push for more education for girls and more equality within marriage and divorce. In reality, girls are included in education, but it's very gender-specific education as it is separate from boys. And women don't play much of a role in public life at this time. However, one positive for Japan is that due to their progression and modernization, they are identified as an equal on the world stage. And as a result of that, Japan will eventually imperialize along with Europe, and the US. And that's the gist of how industrialization works in Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and China. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure and do so and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. I'll see you next time. From 1850 to 1864, the Taiping Uprising, from 1850 to the Empress Sichi. They also establish a constitutional monarchy. As activists try to urge the end of prostitution.